She told me not to dig deeper, said it had nothing to do with me. But at long last it was my turn to pay back my debt. I've been described a lot of ways over the years. Difficult, unreachable, a lost cause with good enough grades to make teachers feel guilty about giving up. I moved schools 3 times before I was 15. Not expelled, they were always careful about the wording. Not the right fit. Needs a more specialized environment. We feel another setting would better serve his needs. Polite ways of saying the same thing. I'm not going to tell you what I did. Some of it I'm not proud of. Some of it I understand better now than I did then. What I'll tell you is that by the time I landed at Blossom Secondary, I had already decided that adults were a specific kind of useless. Well-meaning mostly. Useless nonetheless. I'd had counselors before, 3 of them, all decent people doing a decent job. They asked the right questions, kept good notes, referred me onward with careful language. None of it touched anything. Daisy Calloway was the guidance counselor at Blossom. She was in her late 40s, wore reading glasses she was always losing, and had the particular quality of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. She didn't try to reach me. That was the first thing I noticed. Everyone else tried. She just made space. Like she had all the time in the world and none of it was conditional on me performing recovery for her benefit. I'm not going to tell you what she said that changed things. Partly because I'm still not sure I have the language for it. Partly because it belongs to me. What I'll tell you is that by the end of that year I was still difficult. Still had edges that caught people. But I had something I hadn't had before. A direction. I left that city at 18. Didn't look back much. Built something. Took years, wrong turns, a few moments where the old version of me nearly made a catastrophic decision in a boardroom instead of a school corridor. But it held. Whatever she'd built in me, it held. I came back for the first time in 11 years because I had a week with nowhere to be, and I thought, just once, I'd like to see the place without needing to escape it. The city had changed the way mid-sized cities change. New developments on the edge, same exhaustion in the middle. I drove past Blossom on the second day without planning to, just ended up there. The building was the same. The gates looked older. I asked around about Daisy through someone I'd stayed loosely in touch with, kept it casual, just curious how people from back then were doing. The answer I got back wasn't casual. I sat with it for a full day before I let myself react. That was new. The old version of me would have reacted immediately and badly. Instead, I sat in my hotel room and I was very, very still. Daisy Calloway had been accused of professional misconduct 3 years earlier. A formal complaint. A full investigation. The specific allegation, I'll be precise because the precision matters, was that she had formed an inappropriate emotional dependency with a vulnerable student. That she had manipulated that relationship for her own psychological benefit. That her methods constituted a safeguarding violation. She lost her license. The case was never criminal, but it didn't need to be. A canceled license and the institutional language surrounding it was enough. She was working checkout shifts at a supermarket 20 minutes from the school she'd given 20 years to. I want to be careful here about what I tell you I felt. Anger is too small a word. It wasn't hot either. It was cold and it was familiar. The kind of feeling I used to get at 15 in the corridor outside a head teacher's office. The feeling that told me the adults in the room had made a decision about something they didn't understand, using language that made the decision sound reasonable, and I was the only one who could see the gap between what they said and what was actually true. I'd felt that feeling 100 times as a kid. I'd learned to use it. I made a phone call, then another, then I went for a drive. Her shift ended at 6. I didn't approach her in the car park. I'm not a movie. I waited until she was away from the building, walking toward the bus stop before I said her name. She turned around. She looked at me for a moment with the careful expression of someone who has learned not to be surprised by anything. Then something shifted. She said, "You look well." I said, "You look tired." She laughed, first genuine thing either of us had said. We got coffee. She was resistant. I want to be honest about that. She was not a woman waiting to be rescued. She asked me twice what I was doing back. Asked once directly if I'd heard what happened. When I said yes, she went quiet in a way that told me she'd had a version of this conversation before and it had cost her something. I told her I wasn't there to relitigate anything. She said, "Then why are you here?" I said, "I'm just catching up with someone I know. Is that all right?" She looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup, with the same expression she used to use when she knew I was doing something she hadn't fully diagnosed yet. She let it go. For that evening, she let it go. I drove home and started pulling threads. Here's what I knew going in. The allegation was technically unfalsifiable. That's how these things work. Emotional manipulation leaves no physical evidence. A close relationship with a troubled student can be read two ways depending on who's doing the reading. Whoever had constructed this had done it carefully. They'd taken something real, a genuine, intense, unconventional professional relationship, and reframed it just enough. The question wasn't whether Daisy was guilty. I knew the answer to that. The question was who had needed her gone and why. 20 years at the same institution. Guidance counselor. The kind of staff member who knew where every body was buried because she'd been in the room when half the decisions were made. She'd have known which students had been failed and how, which incidents had been managed quietly instead of properly, which senior staff had made calls that prioritized the school's reputation over a kid's welfare. Someone with that knowledge, who couldn't be bought and wouldn't be quiet, is a specific kind of problem for a specific kind of administrator. I'm not going to give you a name yet. That comes later. I spent 6 days in that city. I told myself it was still a holiday. I met with a solicitor. I flew in. I wasn't using anyone local. Told him to start from the complaint itself and work backwards. Who filed it? What the timeline looked like? Whether the investigation had followed its own procedural guidelines to the letter. It hadn't. Not dramatically. Not in a way that looked like sabotage from the outside. But there were gaps. Response timelines that were too fast. A witness statement that corroborated the allegation from someone who hadn't been a student at the school during the relevant period. A detail that had apparently not been verified. An appeals process that Daisy had been technically entitled to, but hadn't been clearly informed of in the required time frame. Small things. The kind of small things that are either incompetence or intent and are very hard to distinguish until you look at the pattern. I looked at the pattern. The head teacher at Blossom during the investigation was a man named Philip Matthew. He'd retired 18 months after Daisy's license was canceled. Retired well, apparently. Consultancy work, a couple of school board positions. The kind of quiet landing that tends to follow a favor cleanly done. I dug into Matthew. What I found wasn't dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was bureaucratic and ugly and mundane in the way that actual institutional harm usually is. 3 years before the complaint against Daisy, she had raised a formal concern about how a specific incident involving a student had been recorded. The student in question had made allegations against a staff member. Those allegations had been, in Daisy's documented opinion, in writing, filed properly, inadequately investigated and incorrectly classified. The staff member was still employed. The student had left the school. The file had been closed. Daisy had not let it go. She'd escalated twice and been told twice that the matter had been reviewed and resolved. The third escalation never went anywhere because 3 months later she was under investigation herself. I sat with that document for a long time. I went back to see her on the 5th day. She knew by then that I'd been doing something. I hadn't told her, but she'd always been good at reading what was in the room. She asked me to stop, not angrily, quietly. She said she'd made her peace with it, said she was tired of the whole thing living in the front of her life and she'd found a way to put it toward the back. I said, there's a student from the original complaint you filed, the one before any of this started. She went still. I said, they're an adult now. I haven't contacted them, but I think they'd want to be contacted. She looked at me for a long time. She said, how did you find all of this? I said, I had a good teacher. She didn't say anything to that, but she stopped asking me to stop. I'm going to compress the next part, not because it wasn't important, it was, but because the mechanics of it are less interesting than the result. The student, now in their mid-20s, had never stopped wanting to be heard, had assumed nobody was listening, was willing to speak formally on record with proper legal support which I arranged. The procedural gaps in Daisy's investigation, combined with the original filed concern and the timeline connecting it to Matthew's conduct, were enough to trigger a formal review, not of Daisy, of the investigation itself. Matthew's consultancy contracts evaporated quietly about 2 weeks before anything went public. That's how those men operate. They feel the ground shift before anyone announces the earthquake. The review took 4 months. I wasn't in the city for most of it. I stayed in contact with the solicitor. I stayed in contact with Daisy more than I had in the previous 11 years. She called me the morning the outcome came through. She said, they're reinstating the license. I said, I know, I got the email. She said, you're on the correspondence. I said, I'm listed as the instructing party. I probably should have mentioned that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you were always the most infuriating student I ever had. I said, you told me that was a compliment. She said it was. She went back to work, not at Blossom, that building held too much by then, a different school, newer. She told me in a message that the kids there were difficult, which she said like it was good news. I think for her it was. I went back to what I'd been building. The week in that city had turned into 5 months of phone calls and documents, and a level of focused obsession I recognized from somewhere specific inside myself. The place she taught me to aim at something rather than just at everything. I'm not going to tell you what she did that changed things. I said that at the start and I meant it. But I'll tell you this. There's a version of me that grew up in that city and never left it. Not physically, I left physically, but a version of me that stayed inside the feeling of being a problem that couldn't be solved. That version of me would have recognized Daisy's situation and felt rage and done something loud and costly and ultimately useless with it. The version of me that actually showed up did something quiet instead. She taught me the difference. I don't think she even knew she was doing it. The best lessons usually work that way.